I am so pleased and privileged to have Stephanie May on the Geospatial Index for the next 4 episodes. She is former director of geospatial at Stamen Design, a well-known contributor to our industry. So for this session, we'll be looking at her personal career trajectory, and needless to say, stay tuned for the next 3 episodes after that to find out what those will be about. Thank you, Stephanie, for coming on.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for having me. My pleasure. It's great to be here.
I'm slightly intimidated, but yeah, looking forward to relaxing and listening into how you built up your career, I guess, starting with education.
Sure. So my educational background, I studied environmental science at Stanford and then took a long break to figure out the meaning of life. And then...
Don't we all?
Yeah. Cracked it, totally figured it out, just kidding. Instead went and got a master's in geographic information science from San Francisco State University. And that was in the 2010 to 2013 era that I was in that master's program in San Francisco. Not to presage too much, but that at that time, that's when Apple Maps catastrophically launched. And then, there was a lot of backfilling of GIS talent. There was some, it was an interesting period during graduate school because there were people kind of petering off and doing a mysterious project in Cupertino the whole time. And then, we'll get there, but eventually I ended up there as well. But so that's my educational background. My career took a strong turn, I would say, towards the end of that. My master's thesis was in urban climatology, urban microclimatology. I was interested in mapping the vertical stratification of near surface air masses. So trying to measure... How
close to the surface is that? You're talking kilometers, meters?
Between 1.5 meters. So I was my master's thesis work involved biking around in and out of Golden Gate Park with 1.5 meter tall pole strapped to a bike, and thermocouples mounted at 6 different heights, plus some other instrumentation. The idea being that most of the time we approximate surface temperatures by looking at imagery, satellite imagery or aerial imagery, which really just is literally the surface. We know that air is a bad conductor of heat, and yet we use that approximation all the time. So I was curious, okay, if you get 1.5 meters off the ground, and how is air really moving within that 1.5 meters that's important for humans? And we know that it's going to be moving differently over a cool surface like a park versus an urban surface, because air that's heated from the bottom is unstable. So that was my master's thesis, was collecting all this data, munging it around in R. Meanwhile, I was working for the San Francisco Department of Public Health as an environmental exposure analyst. And I was thinking a lot, like within that role, it was primarily, I would say, a GIS role with some epidemiology mixed in, looking at the environmental determinants of health and doing a lot of analyses there. But I was pretty interested in the coming revolution of web maps, right? So Mapbox was just starting out, and this was really, I feel like, the first time, even Google Maps wasn't really that old, right? It launched in 2007. And so people were kind of excited about what they could do with the types of technologies behind Google Maps, first with raster tiles and then with vector tiles. And what was particularly interesting to me, both in my government work and in, this emergent mapping and tech world, was the opportunities for cartography, and really specifically the opportunities for cartography as information design. So um,
Oh, sorry. You'll have to define information design there. That might be a new term for some listeners.
I think so. I think, yeah, and thanks for breaking in with that. So information design, think of, say, an infographic. Think of how there are times when a story is best told with a picture, and it's easier to draw that picture than it is to, say, create it from data with a data visualization, right? And it's easier, not strictly because it's easier to do the artwork, but because it's easier to really, really design around what you need to say, instead of being beholden to, cleaning up enough signal to noise to really convey something, right? So that's information design. And information design as it relates to, say, data visualization, which is much more hewn to showing what the data says. And similarly, in cartography, Mark Mortimer famously wrote How to Lie with Maps, really. And I think the underlying moral lesson there is that we're always, quote unquote, lying cartographically when we create a map. It's just a matter of how artfully we do it. And ideally, we want that artistry to convey a higher, more important truth more clearly. It's so easy to lose an audience, really, I think, is maybe the most succinct way that I would have of putting this. And I was seeing that in the tech world. I was seeing that, at the time, it's just like there were a lot of mashups. Like before Mapbox came around, pretty much if you wanted to make what a lot of people were doing with web maps was just sticking stuff on top of, hacking a way to stick stuff on top of Google Maps, and it looks horrible, right? Because Google Maps are already quite busy and not a particularly muted design product, and then you're trying to stick a bunch of stuff on top of it that's loud enough that people will see it. And or an overlay of something like a choropleth overlay. It just looked horrible, but it was still cool. It was still kind of state of the art. But I was kind of interested in the next step beyond, where we're really able to tailor that visual presentation to the message that we actually want to show. So I was curious, I really felt like TileMill was the thing that made it possible to really do that, which was a tool that Mapbox put out in the early 2010s. So that was a really cool development. And then on the flip side, in government, I was doing work with this really, really bright group of epidemiologists who were really thinking outside of the box about environmental health and what it meant for people in San Francisco and people around the country. And coming up with all these different indicators and all these different analyses, but we were presenting all of them, as PDFs straight out of ArcMap, posted on the web. And I hated it so much. And I mean, there was the exception, of course, was that for certain, especially traffic data, there were a few of these WMS style, click on and off a whole bunch of layers kinds of presentations out there. It's like, here you go, Gen Public, have fun with this. Like, here's you can click on and off all these layers and see all this data, but no real viewpoint to it, I guess I would say, and just a
catalog of all the data for the organization, and sluggish as hell to load and all the usual issues.
Yeah, and those were like the best. Those were the best of the best, right? The other state of the art in open data and government data at that time was Socrata. Does that you remember Socrata? Anyone remember Socrata?
Never heard of that.
Yeah, that was just an open data platform, and the geospatial component, it was just just upload your shape files. Well, which is just really a zip file. Well, okay, you have to download it to look at it. Well, okay, what kind of garbage is it going to be? And so that was the other thing that I was doing, that I had access to at the Department of Public Health. This was also, that's the other movement that's going on in parallel with all these things, in parallel with this explosion in the ability to display things on maps and do all of these data visualizations. Within government, there were these. There was this push for more open data, open governance. That was the beginning of that. to me, I look back on it, but I even felt this way at the time. It was a bit naive because it was like, all right, we're just going to push out our data. Here you go. Or like, like there was this imagining in the public that the government had like absolutely every data set available. I remember going to a citywide GIS meeting where a developer came to present. He wanted to build an app about parking, and he wanted the city to give him all of the digitized polygons for all the parking spaces in the city. And that was hilarious because, of course, there is no such data set. But he had it in his PowerPoint, like showing one of those little cylinders, for a data store.
Wow.
So it must exist. Anyway.
That would be quite a project for an intern, I guess. if
any
local government ever did that.
Well, and when I was starting out in GIS, I mean, GIS in the 90s, what was it except digitizing those types of data sets? Right. So, if you started in GIS in that time, what grunt work that was to georeference and digitize all of these print maps that, had been maintained manually for, whatever, decades.
I feel like the industry is still digitizing, but it's moved over to digitizing reality now. Like you've got Matterport, where you just have a camera that gets a 3D scene or model of a building, but in a way it's still a form of digitization. But anyway, not to sidetrack things, but I wonder if when are we going to stop?
Well, no, I think that's an excellent point. We are still digitizing. And when are we going to stop? Probably never, because there's diminishing returns to digitizing almost anything, right? And it's difficult to know who decides that and, from what source. So, yeah, there's, I think most cities now have at least some aerial imagery product or some things that they're digitizing from. There's LiDAR, there's all kinds of digitization happening. But it's, there's lots of pie in the sky notions about what we could do with a digital twin of blah blah blah, and some of those visions are compelling and some of them are expensive. And many of them are both.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess to tie this back to or round out the point of your first position with the San Francisco Department of Public Health, the main learning or challenge was how government should share maps and data with the public.
Yeah, I would say that that's true. I started developing, at that time, I really developed some core convictions around cartography and what it should be. Number one, so relating to this point that we're just making, you can't put everything on a map because you lose people. You really have to, if you have a clear message that you want to show, it has to be front and center. I remember reading an article at this time that was very formative for me, because it really it was a study of what people do when they encounter web maps, and it showed that the vast majority of people don't slide any sliders, they don't click on and off any layers, they just look at the map exactly as you've presented it to them. And I'll say, and so I realized this, and I was like, okay, so we're going the wrong way if we're expecting any viewer to come in and define what this map is about. It has to be right there. It has to be right there for people. And the caveat, the additional thing that I'll add is that, having since worked on a lot of global base maps, the other thing that people do almost without exception when you present them with a global base map is zoom in on where they live or someplace familiar and check that and just ground truth there. Right. So understanding those things. So that's what your viewer is going to care about, are the places on the ground that are meaningful to them. So those two convictions were very strong, and as I was starting to be more involved in managing and releasing these public data sets, I was kind of I had these convictions. I was holding on to these convictions, but I hadn't really not a lot of power to really put them out in the world. What I was seeing around me was that it was still the prevailing paradigm was still PDFs and WMS style maps. And then the other thing was just this, push for open data, which just meant like release your government data now, without and like there wasn't really a lot of attention to how important metadata is, for example, contextualizing like what is this data actually, what can you reliably say or not say about it. And so all of that brought me to start experimenting on my own with what types of analyses I could do that really embodied these principles. And one you and I have pre-discussed a little bit is a map that I made in 2013 that went viral. It was a rent map of San Francisco. And we can share with your audience because they did finally get it back up and running. It's been defunct since 2020 when Mapbox deprecated the support of TileMill 1.0. But I converted it to PM tiles and stuck it in the App Libre page. So I've got the beginning again. But this map, essentially, I started with a choropleth of studio and one-bedroom house prices in San Francisco at the time in 2013. Choropleth based on neighborhoods in San Francisco. But it really felt like that was only telling part of the story. So what I did instead was applied an environmental sampling type of analysis. Long history of doing this in GIS, right? But I don't know if we do enough of it. The specific method that I used, a darling of the ArcGIS world, was empirical Bayesian kriging.
Just love that.
And I was able to create this surface. And by the time I got done with it, by the time I passed it from ArcGIS through Illustrator and into TileMill to be something that was interactive, the colors are quite lovely. I layered in some contour lines so that you could really see almost the level surface of how rent varied across the city, and then just put it out there. And it went viral, I think, because it just was different. It was both because aesthetically it was quite lovely, and also because it was different from how people were used to seeing data like this shown. And I think the third reason is just that it felt to me at least like a validation of these principles that I had, these opinions that I had started to form.
I feel like we're developing a bit of a segue here into your second position at urban mapping, where you were a geographic storyteller. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I left the city of San Francisco and went to my first startup. When I found this kind of wingnut job post for a geographic storyteller position, and I shouldn't say I found it, my office mate found it and was like, this position sounds like you should apply. So eternally grateful to her for that. And the business of urban mapping, it does seem like it should be a good segue. And in some ways it is. Urban mapping was a really, right, because we are talking about mapping urban environments. Urban mapping was the brainchild of Ian White, who was a very prominent personality in the kind of Where 2.0 early days of maps in tech, and a very genial guy, very interesting guy, and quite a character. He created urban mapping. He had a few different projects that initially made money. One was this thing called the Panamap, which was just like you look at the map, you could see different demographic factors by looking at the map at different angles. The next thing he did was create
This is a physical map?
It was a physical map. Yeah, the first
cool.
one called Panamap. Yeah.
I'm imagining some sort of holographic surface where you get a
Correct.
different view. It was
Correct.
like oh wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it was cool. It was cool. It was a cool little map. And then the next thing he did was create a nationwide, I think it might have been global. I can't remember now. I wasn't close enough to it. A neighborhood data set that he sold to all the tech companies in the early days who wanted to be able to show neighborhood data. So relevant in that sense. Beyond that, though, it was really the lessons that I learned at urban mapping had much more to do with the how to create a business model around geographic data and geographic representation. That's really what I think urban mapping was about overall. Ian had created a set of APIs called Mapfluence, which was built on PostGIS, kind of early days built on PostGIS. And the idea was that you could ask a question and it would give you back a map. So super relevant in a lot of, like, it's really presaged a lot of my thinking about how large language models might influence how we interact with geospatial, because it was that kind of basic idea in a lot of ways, but like really before its time.
So you had a natural language interface.
No. It wasn't. No, it was when we spent a lot of time. I remember very fondly spending time with, it was you passed a GeoJSON with a bunch of parameters, like you would with any API. But the part that's similar was more so that there was an expectation that Mapfluence would take these parameters, parse them, and then give you back what you wanted, whether that was, often that was a map. So, like the idea was that you would pass these parameters and be able to see kind of like, okay, where are the zip codes in San Francisco where there's this type of store, or, it was all kinds of things like that. It was pretty reaching. But it was like I say, it was a bit before its time. So, having really the full scale of data to support everything that you would want. But you can see how it's similar from a UI UX perspective to an overall experience to what we're imagining is, the direction that say ChatGPT might go if ChatGPT were truly spatially aware. But for the most part, the intention was that it would be used by an IT department for an insurance company or a sales department in a company that they wanted that sort of spatial insight into where their customers might be. So it also wasn't particularly focused on solving social problems like homelessness. Unfortunately, there was none of that. And my role, to some extent, was my role was dog fooding the product, and then also trying to create interesting stories.
Did you say dog fooding? What's that?
I didn't. I was hoping that would slip by, because that was literally the term that was presented to me on my first day, and I had no idea.
Is that an American term?
I still don't really like that term. It's a tech industry term, and it actually comes from, but it's a tech industry term. The idea is that you should be consuming your own product.
Okay. Because
that's the only way, QA, QC, blah, blah, blah. The only way you're really going to know if it's good is if you eat it. And it's actually, I think it's from a story about a dog food company. I do appreciate your reaction there, because that was my reaction too on my first day in this job, when I was told that essentially my job was to eat dog food. But yum.
Developers, so I was doing that. There's always a lot of strange terms in software development, it seems.
Yeah, yak shaving, bike shedding, dog fooding. There's a lot of it like ings.
Right.
Interesting ings.
We'll develop a catalog. Okay, so how on earth did you go from this to Apple?
Well, so I was there for about a year. And during that time, Apple Maps had really pivoted towards embracing needing a lot more in-house domain expertise in geospatial. And so I was recruited initially for a role on the nascent indoor mapping project as a spec developer. But so that's what I did. That's how I transitioned to Apple, was to work on thinking through that data spec. Pretty quickly, I pivoted towards cartography, because that's where my real interest still was. And so I joined the cartography team a year after I joined Apple, and that's where the bulk of my experience at Apple was. It was interesting to transition. It was an interesting transition, one that maybe not everyone fully appreciates, how different the conventions and norms are around creating a global reference map versus, everything that we've talked about so far, which is more in the realm of thematic mapping, where really your concern is primarily around how to tell the best story about the data that you're working with instead of how to create a one-to-one reference with reality, which is really kind of what Apple's core project had become at that point, because they'd really learned that getting that 80% correct was very not good enough. So that was an interesting project in and of itself. And for me, there were learnings on a couple of levels, right? Initially, it was, I had to really kind of reorganize all of my thinking around this reference map paradigm. And initially, be extremely myopic about a base map, essentially, right? Like, that was what almost all of our work entailed, was trying to create, like looking, being full bleed, full screen on the base map aspect of things, and really kind of getting everything right, the iconography, the layers, bringing in new features. A lot of what I was involved in were the more technical aspects of building, the workflows around it. That's kind of more what preoccupied me and took up my time. So really it was about, but it was also kind of front and center with design process in this way that I hadn't necessarily been before at that scale, the complex design process. So coming from a style sheet, iterating and needing to see at the same time, as you're changing a parameter in a style sheet, what's that effect? And like, cheat, nudge it, and get it in there, iterating on an iPhone.
What's a style sheet?
A style sheet is it's a structured text file that contains all of the parameters that are passed to a renderer in order to transform data in an application into the visual representation that you see. The style sheet encodes the Z order of the layers, what's on top of what. It encodes the line widths and opacities and shades of every single part of that layer. So it's what you use to create the right visual hierarchy when you're trying to layer a lot of reference material together. It contains references to, typically, at least in like style sheets as they're structured right now, we could go deep and I can tell you what I think is wrong with this, but right now it also contains references to the specific style set that it applies to. It contains, like, at least in the vector mapping context, this is how a style sheet, style sheets are not only a convention of maps. In fact, they're more a convention of they're a convention of web, right? So right. CSS, typically for a web page, you would
cascading
write
style sheets, right?
Well, yeah. Cascading style sheets, exactly right.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the like the web mapping style sheets for web maps, so are inherit a lot of paradigms from that, but also there's the special requirements of a web map. Typically with a reference map like the one we're describing, you want to be able to zoom in and pan around. So there's a lot of encoding that's around that functionality as well, and so it goes well beyond. And because it's being applied to data that's much more complex than, say, just the elements of a web page, there's a lot more complexity to the style sheet languages for maps.
Sure, you're making me think there might be a style sheet almost for each zoom level.
In a way, not typically. It's not, and you wouldn't want that, right? Because,
or is it that the settings change per zoom level at least?
It's the latter.
Right. Yeah. Wow, that sounds incredibly complex.
It can be, right? And so the big paradigms in style sheets for vector tile maps, initially the way TileMill worked was based on this language called Cardo CSS, which very much follows the cascading style sheets paradigm, and that there's inheritance in that you can write rules that apply for where you can kind of be filtering directly in the style sheet and then saying, I want this rule to apply to this specific set of features at these specific zooms, right? That was kind of the early innovation, or the exploded my brain and made everything possible innovation of TileMill. But Cardo CSS less used now.
Mhm.
There was a shift at a certain point to strictly just structuring everything in a big old JSON, and that's because there just came to be too many parameters.
Mhm.
So Mapbox, MapLibre these days run off of style parameters in a big old custom. There's a spec for it, but a big old custom JSON, which is an ordered, and that JSON is an ordered list of styles, of layers, style layers, right?
Yeah.
And you can,
Fascinating.
yeah. So that's how these paradigms exist that have manifested within web mapping. So when you're talking about the style sheet for a persistent global reference map that's at the core of a major software application, such as Apple Maps or Google Maps, you're talking about something that's going to end up being tens, thousands, millions of lines long, potentially,
Insane.
to cover every, and it's not, every zoom is fairly straightforward to handle. Every device, right? Every screen width, every feature, that's where things become a bit more, every version of every device, that's where things typically become more complicated. So at Apple, over time, it starts with getting used to that very, like, the simplest case of just needing to make a change to the style sheet. But over time, you kind of you realize, then the next thing is, okay, well, for this new feature release, we need to layer this new thing into the map and launch it to 1 billion people. Okay, well, now we need to start thinking about how we're going to be maintaining what's become a pretty major code base with real tech debt, and continue to send out updates to billions of users. Okay, now we need to think about other, we've primarily, when we're talking about style sheets, we're only talking about one of the assets. The other major assets that get shipped to you in order for you to, that you need locally or somewhere in order to render a map, are fonts and icons and shields, things like that. So there's the whole separate process for picking the thing. It's a very specific set of knowledge, set of assets, but that's how it's done. That's how it's been done for the last 10 years.
I've got a couple of questions. So are you saying that an iPhone user doesn't just get a bunch of images basically as the map? In fact, as part of installing Apple Maps on the device, you get the style sheet, you get the fonts, you get the icons, and the map is essentially assembled by the phone, on the phone.
In general terms, yes.
Okay.
But in more specific terms, you get a binary. You don't get the style sheet in a readable form, to make that clear. Just in case anyone's like running out to like open up their iPhone and figure it out. You get a binary.
Paste.
You get a compiled version of those instructions. But then you do also get, like, very tightly packed, as compressed as possible. You do also get all the icons that you need. And those icons are localized, right?
Okay.
Like, so the icons that you get in the UK.
Right. So somehow the map that you see is assembled using the app on the phone. It's not all served from a central location. The entire experience.
That's right. It's well, that's right. It's some of those assets need to be, that's actually that's the important difference between a vector tile and a raster tile, or one of the important differences, right? The ones we talk about are just, vector is lines and raster is PNG, and that's true. But that PNG means that all those assets are pre-composited into one picture. So with a raster tile map, literally what you're getting is just the tiles, the tiles that will make the picture of the map at the scale that you want. So all of that render logic is happening remotely. Whereas with a vector map, that render logic is happening on your device by design. And that's actually a good segue to kind of like where my mind started to wander. Once I kind of mastered the the ecosystem of services that goes into producing these maps at Apple, which was back towards the user experience and back towards like, okay, well, okay, we have all the, like, we're dealing with vector tiles, right? We're dealing with like SVGs, essentially SVGs and, little tiny pictures that we're using to decorate it. And, we're, over in the web space, over on Canvas, there's this concept of the DOM, and there's all this cool stuff you can do with it, once it's there in your browser. That's not really what we do with vector tiles. It's so abstracted once it's in your browser that even though it's all broken up into these little pieces and composed on your phone, it's very hard. There's no really semantic way to manipulate it interactively once it's there, which is really weird, right? Do you follow me with that one?
So not hugely, and that's basically because I don't have the relevant technical background, but it's certainly fascinating to listen to.
Oh yeah, well, so let me step back then. So since Web 2.0, I guess there's been this concept of the DOM. A lot of the especially data visualization JavaScript libraries are about manipulating the DOM. So if you haven't, document object model.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And the idea there, say, if you're working with a language like D3 or a bunch of other languages, the idea is that, these are kind of more within the paradigms of these programming libraries, you're able to write a syntax that's about like, okay, take this thing in the DOM, maybe it's an SVG circle, and make it bounce around, or attach it to this other thing, or draw a line between here and between this one and that one to show there's a relationship between them, right? Like that's kind of the fundamental of how the DOM, like what really made it possible to do a lot of cool interactivity in the DOM in this era, right? And that's all based on being able to render SVGs in your browser. So it would follow, if you're very naive, that you should also be able to do some cool interactive stuff with these SVGs that you're rendering for vector tile maps, but it's not that simple, because the way that those maps come to you, well, first of all, they come to you primarily, it's a protobuf. And there's a bunch of this is changing. So forgive me, audience, if I am not totally up on, there's like GeoParquet, and there's some like new stuff, that's new updates to the MB tile spec, and But anyway, in any case, primarily, sorry, I'm like, we can get out of the weeds.
But I'm not going to let you get away without defining what a protobuf is, or telling us a bit of detail there as well. Unless I am, with each of these questions, dramatically waylaying you such that we don't finish this episode.
Well, I think maybe we save the details of protobufs for. Let's not get back, because there's. Google it. Okay. Protobuf, PM tile, MB tile. All of these are essentially. What's important to understand for this conversation about those. Yep. Is their primary? Those are GeoParquet. All of these geospatial formats are all designed to help with transmitting data in the cloud, and their primary purpose is to make the volume of that data manageable. Their primary purpose is not to make it more accessible. Let's say it that way, right? It's so that you can have a fast and seamless rendering experience.
Okay.
It's not so that you can decompress, understand, like take apart and understand what the pieces in there are.
Okay. I've got some other questions, I guess, just about the nature generally. I mean, there's I could go on for hours about, and anybody I think would want to go on for hours about what it was like to do cartography at a place like Apple. How big was the team?
That's a difficult question to answer, because I went through about 3 or 4 different reorgs, and there was, different models. I think what's interesting about Apple really is that they employed cartographers at all, and specifically people with that title. Relatively few at any time. I think really the person responsible for a lot of that convention was Justin O'Barron, who was an early hire in Apple Maps and very much adapted to that cartographer moniker. Google certainly never had any to this day, I don't know if there's like official cartographers. It doesn't have the same meaning. That said, the meaning of
it's
Apple
actually
changed.
Apple that I would have expected to of any tech company hire a cartographer, because Apple's known for caring about design.
And that's true. And that's, I think that is a part of it. Like my experience at Apple though was, a lot of kind of the generation of cartography that I came up with was so preoccupied with the space map experience. And this was really kind of the thing that I initially like, that it dawned on me a year or two in, like what I started encountering when I was exposed to the larger world of design at Apple was that doesn't fully account for the entire user experience. That doesn't fully account for what you really experience. So much of what you're really experiencing when you open Apple Maps UI is about the application overall. So Apple was also where I got, like, eventually I got a lot more exposure to things like manipulating the camera in a first-person navigation experience and making that experience quite organic, and routing and all of those different paradigms, like what should all of those conventions be around that UI experience. The base map is the least of it, and in fact, over indexing on the base map causes you to lose a lot, right? Like, so that brings me back to kind of where I was before all of this experience, when focused on, like, okay, like your map just has to be really tailored to what it is narrowly that you want to show, otherwise you're going to lose people. And the same really goes for designing an overall user experience with a map. This really came to bear in thinking through, and subsequent to my career at Apple, this is the lesson that I've really carried forward is, okay, if you're designing a navigation experience, you get all kind, I've had many clients since then who wanted help with their navigation experiences. And the number one thing I want to tell them is, like, okay, don't expect someone who's driving to see anything that you render on the base map. It's a safety hazard for you to be relying on the base map in that way. The base map is just the background at that point. They're peripherally watching the route line, and what they're getting from the base map is the basic morphology of the street network, and maybe a couple of other things like the stoplights. Those are great, but those are all UI layer elements: stoplights, stop signs, all that stuff.
And I imagine there's been a ton of research done into this, because actually my master's at Melbourne was about human wayfinding performance in urban contexts, and I was comparing performance in terms of navigation success, or actually route recall, in different circumstances. Stimuli involving landmarks, or stimuli involving landmarks plus cardinal directions as prompts for turns and things like that. What you're saying makes me think that there must have been a ton of academic work really about what is retained in memory from people's experience under different circumstances, like driving or walking. God, I'm overwhelmed because there's so many directions to take this in what you.
Oh man, I mean, if there is a ton of research on it, then I would love to see that research. I know that there is some, right, and there's been some experimentation with it, and that's actually a really interesting field of study, and one that I felt like it was really going somewhere about like 2015 era. You were hearing a lot about landmark-based navigation and adjusting some of our paradigms to be more inclusive of the fact that most outside of so much is US centric and maybe even California centric, and I really felt that at Apple. Like, so much of what we're designing
hang on.
great in Cupertino.
I can name drop an organization here. I think it was UCSB. There was a spatial cognition research lab there that I had some interactions with in my research, and I did manage to publish one peer-reviewed article on this landmark-based navigation thing. It's good to know that it somehow percolated through into industry.
There were a few startups that I can remember. I remember, oh man, I wish that I had kept in better touch with her. All I can remember right now is her name is also Stephanie. But she had one startup, and then there were, I'm not sure really what happened to them. But I mean, but I think I'd be curious what you think of. How would you really like take that from the realm of research to the realm of a mass produced navigation experience.
Yeah, well, so this topic actually came up in the last episode that was published with Ed Freifogel from OpenCage, which is a open source based, open data based geocoder. And I mentioned the same sort of landmark based navigation sort of recommendation or prompt landmark based prompts that researchers are saying should be introduced. And he said, in terms of OpenStreetMap, there's actually too many landmarks now. You're just going to it's the issue of what is the salient landmark. And funnily enough, back in 2010 when I was doing that master's, the issue of salience came up, and there was a number of different ways that you could measure salience, just from semantics to do with the user profile and what was meaningful to them. I don't know, this is like a bit of a silly way to characterize it, but it's the one that springs to mind. So the type of religion they have means that different types of religious landmarks are more meaningful to that navigator, right? There's also salience in terms of the size of the friggin' landmark, the color of it, other aspects of the structure, its proximity really to the street itself, so there was some early work again from, I think, academics in Germany about how to in a programmatic way derive the most salient landmarks from the millions that a user or a navigator might encounter. Anyway, yeah, but I guess my overall point is that there doesn't seem to have been there hasn't been a heavy going shift. It's still basically travel this many meters, turn right or left. Landmarks don't appear to the navigation experience for apps like Apple Maps hasn't pivoted to landmark centric, it seems.
I think so. That's right. And now that you're saying all that about salience, it's becoming quite familiar. I don't have a good. I think that it's an interesting, and so you can see. I think essentially, reflecting back to what you're saying is this is a solvable problem, right? Like we could create enough hierarchy in the available landmarks that we could, create like a more natural experience. And I don't know if you tuned into this, but there was a time when you were getting quite a lot of Google was really experimenting with this, and you'd get like in the US, you get a lot of turn left at the Jack in the Box.
Oh, really? Cool. or whatever fast food chain had paid for the advertising.
In the US context, it's kind of just hilarious. And everyone's like, oh, did Jack in the Box pay for this? Like, what are they even doing? Or like turn right at the Starbucks. Like, that's really that's how I saw it in the US context. So
it's good to know that it was adopted though. I'm glad to hear that.
It was there were at least experiments with it. And I would actually say too, so the thing that has become convention out of that time, at least in the US and parts of Europe, is traffic signal and stoplight data, right? Because that's something, and I think that's because it's more fundamentally reducible. And that does and therefore more universal, right? Like if you have reliable data about where the traffic control devices are, you can navigate around those, and it feels much more organic than.
Yeah. Okay, so you're saying that inserted into the directions will be at the upcoming traffic light or signal, turn this or that direction. Okay.
Go through the next light and right. Then turn right. That's been adopted by Apple Maps as part of Google Maps, and that's something that I think that was towards the end. I can tell. I don't want to. I'm thinking of the person in my mind who was really responsible for that stoplight and stop sign innovation at Apple, and it wasn't actually something that was like really driven by research, because that's not really how Apple works. I think that's more like there are other companies that are much more kind of user research driven. This was really like one particular designer who was like, and maybe he had read the research and he knew that it was important, but he was like, we can do this and we're gonna. And cool. To his credit, I think it's a tremendous feature, and and I don't know, that's how it happened at Apple. I don't know if it happened independently at Google, but I do in my mind I associate that like there was a lot of experimentation in the space, and that's what ended up getting adopted.
It has to be said though that the building blocks are there because we've got Street View globally practically. So that's another amazing resource that can somehow be machine read. To make measures of salience. So it's nice to hear from an insider like yourself that it was recognized, the need for, or the possibility to improve the navigation experience using landmarks. I have, and it's great to hear that at least in the US, there was an effort with a fast food chain. But I have to say myself that I'm knowing what all the research says and knowing that we have, it seems to be technically possible. I'm a little bit disappointed that it's not fundamental to the navigation experience yet.
Yeah, and I think I think, as with so many things in this space, it's not clear whether it hasn't been integrated because it doesn't have enough utility, or if it hasn't been integrated because it's not easy enough and perceived as too expensive to be doing, or there just isn't enough demand for it. There was an interesting op-ed in the New York Times a month or so ago on this topic that I posted a little thing about on LinkedIn, and I've just been thinking about ever since, because I think there's a rush to assume that these things aren't considered, and I think it's just maybe more accurate to say that there's a lot of complexity that goes into building a robust navigation experience, and figuring out how to layer in something like landmark-based navigation, if it's not universal, just becomes kind of one more thing. And it's if you're designing for a global experience, it's hard. If you were designing a navigational app for a specific area, I think, just as you say, it would be a super cool project to take and there are certainly countries where there's a large population who drives and communicates, navigates around landmarks, where you could build out this type of experience.
And I have an example. Sorry to cut in. So was an Australian mapping web map, and they were owned by Census, which basically owned the white pages and the yellow pages in Australia. So they had a huge listing, effectively, of all the businesses and all of their addresses, and they had landmarks included in their 10x10 directions, and it was done in collaboration with one of my lecturers, actually, at the University of Melbourne. And one of the women who worked on it, she was one of our practical, tutorers. So there was, in terms, you mentioned some startups that you were aware of. That was an example of a local solve, if you like, using landmarks in Australia. But yeah, I completely agree. It's a whole nother level when you've got a multilingual, multicultural, multinational problem to solve in this context. Yeah, and especially, I guess, also where landmarks may be salient for different reasons in different cultures. That's a hard one to solve. Yeah.
It's also really hard and then I think the conversely, it's really hard. I'm curious, how much adoption did Whereas get in the end? How is it used more than?
There were, even at the time, there was this really awkward moment actually in one of the lectures that this woman gave, where she asked everyone to put their hands up about who was using Whereas, and maybe 5% of the class put their hands up, and everyone else was using Google Maps. And I felt terrible because obviously you'd want the local one to be doing well, but Google were, I guess, addressing more customer needs. What can I say?
Well, addressing more customer. I mean, there's a whole, and that's actually really that's actually something that's important to understand if you're really thinking about what, in mapping applications, or in any product manager knows this to some extent, right? Is that what really moves the needle for people is quite different than what they say, what you would want to move the needle.
Yeah. So, do you have any points, I guess, to make about pragmatism in the context of tech companies and doing cartography?
Yeah, what I would say is that there are a million lessons along these lines in product design. Essentially, I think what it comes down to is that although we can all appreciate that certain features would really improve, we want them, and we will articulate that they would really benefit us in theory. In actual practice, they aren't the real movers. They aren't the things that are going to get us to change our flows. Right? And that's, I think, been particularly true in maps, right? Map navigation applications are quite sticky, right? Google Maps, you know how it works. You know how to just put a destination in there, and if it works well enough, you're not going to switch.
I think it's obvious now. So I've really benefited from this conversation, and don't worry, I'm not going to endlessly prolong things here, but I think I understand why in the end, in the context of having a device that's constantly oriented because it has a GPS connection, implementing landmark-based turn-by-turn directions isn't really going to help anyway, because that's in the context of people sharing directions with each other so that they can easily navigate with those directions in their memory, navigate from one point to another. But if you've got a device that's always locating itself, having this extra information about landmarks isn't really going to help, because the device shows you with a moving dot on the map, where you are all the time. So that's
incredibly insightful and incredibly well articulated.
So no wonder they
absolutely. And I'll add one more thing on here that I think makes the landmark-based navigation a bit tricky. A lot of it assumes local knowledge. What if I land in Melbourne today and turn on Google Maps and try to navigate based on landmarks?
Turn left at the MCG. You're not even going to know what the MCG is.
Right.
It's a massive the Melbourne Cricket Ground. Yeah.
So it makes it very hard for that landmark-based localized form of knowledge to really become the predominant way in which we navigate, when one of the things that we really rely on something like a global navigation experience for is the familiarity of the way that those instructions are going to come through. That's okay, well,
inevitably we have turned this into a lengthy and detailed discussion about Apple Maps, and I think it's entirely necessary. I've just got all these other questions in my mind, but I'll have to be disciplined and a friendly user of your time. What can I say, Stephanie? So thanks very much for this initial conversation. I really look forward to hearing, though, about Facebook and Stamen in our next installment. And I'm sure the audience does as well. It's, again, a huge privilege to have you spending the time with us, Stephanie, and we're all listening very carefully.
Well, thanks so much, Will. I've really enjoyed it.